Hello everyone, and welcome to the build guide explainer video for my run and gun spray and pray Pathfinder. The goal of this build is that I really enjoy playing grenades. I played it extensively throughout the 0.3 race cycle, and I've collaborated with a number of top-end speedrunners who are friends of mine on producing build guides for them that are very much tuned to the playstyle of top-end speedrunners, where you can outskill a number of boss mechanics, or where you can rely on precise skill usage to do incredible amounts of damage. However, I wanted to produce a build guide that, one, was based on a more flexible Ascendancy. I think that Pathfinder is going to be one of the most interesting league starters. It allows you to transition into a huge number of different builds because you're going to be able to move your tree around a whole lot, as well as some personal preferences that I have in the way that builds are constructed. So that way they're a little bit easier to use. They have higher stun and ailment thresholds, and also they have better mobility and quality of life in general. So this is not going to be a super optimized glass cannon kill all pinnacles build. This is intended to be a very flexible and easy to use leveling version of grenades. And then if you enjoy the grenade playstyle, I'll be eventually producing a late game mapping version of this build for Pathfinder Grenadier, and we will eventually be able to transition to that. But also you'll be on one of the more flexible Ascendancies, and if you don't enjoy this particular build's playstyle, then you'll be able to transition into other things. One thing that I do want to note is that this is a little bit more mechanically intensive as league starters go. There are a few skill rotation things that you will need to learn, so you definitely need to watch the video all the way through or keep it bookmarked so that way you can answer any FAQs. I will also be live on Twitch throughout all of League Start, so that way if you're playing this on day 1 or 2 and you have any questions about how the build works, or you want to talk about how to modify the build to make it easier for you to use, I will be live on Twitch at twitch.tv/crimsoncasts. That said, let's go ahead and talk about the core grenade skills and why I'm so interested in grenades in 0.4. So, grenades were the dominant racing build of the 0.3 race cycle, and I am a competitive racer in PoE2. And so as a consequence, I've really enjoyed the playstyle. It's also one of the first playstyles that I enjoyed in PoE in general. So I definitely wanted to transition that into a leveling and mapping build. So what you're going to be doing throughout Act 1 is that grenades take a little bit of time for you to get online. They especially struggle with clear, and especially for players who aren't used to managing the longer cooldowns, higher mana costs, and longer detonation timers. But if you are willing to manage those things, you get incredible early damage per second against bosses, which means that we need to do some things to overcome a little bit of the clunkiness of grenades, and then we're going to be smoothing that out with investment of quality of life on tree over the course of the build progression. So in Act 1, we actually go ahead and take a level 1 skill gem from the Forgotten Encampment in the Clearfell, and we cut that into Contagion. So we're going to start off at level 2 when we get off of the riverbank. We're going to buy a crossbow, cut explosive grenade with the level 1 skill gem that we get from Renly, and then we're going to take our second level 1 skill gem, and we're going to cut Contagion just to help us with some of that very early clear. In the first half of Act 1, explosive grenade has a little bit of a longer cooldown, and even a single point investment in Contagion can be enough to get us to level 8 or 10 when we can start to use other skills to help us out a bit more. Then we're going to be cutting explosive grenade, and our first 2 support gems are both going to go into explosive grenade. The first one is going to be multi-shot 1. We'll now be firing 3 grenades instead of 2. They'll be doing slightly reduced damage, but it will actually end up benefiting us in the end. We'll have better AoE, and then also we can pile them up underneath bosses' feet, and then the slightly reduced damage per grenade won't end up mattering as much as the fact that there are 3 of them. Our second support gem cut is going to be Elemental Armament 1. This will allow us to do significantly more elemental attack damage. You'll notice that Explosive Grenade itself has a relatively high amount of conversion. You'll see it converts 80% of base physical damage on your weapon into fire damage. You may be curious why we're not using Fire Attunement, and that's because as we're leveling, we're going to be changing crossbows frequently throughout Act 1, 2, 3, and 4, and as a consequence we want the more generically applicable elemental armament in case a future crossbow has big fire or lightning damage, big lightning or cold damage that we want to use, and so we'd rather just take the generically useful elemental armament instead of something more specialized that we'll end up transitioning to in the end game with Fire Attunement. The other thing that I want to point out is that Contagion has trouble at level 1 promulgating on its own. So we're actually going to take our first level 3 skill gem that we get from Lachlan. We're going to take our first one and we're going to cut Explosive Grenade, the one that we get from Rust King. And then before we get into Hunting Grounds, we're going to get another level 3 and we're going to be able to cut that into Flash Grenade. Flash Grenade does a big amount of stun buildup, which will help us to manage fights against early game bosses, especially bosses like the Executioner and Geonor, who like to move around a lot or who are particularly threatening. And then the other thing is it has a very short detonation timer and does a high amount of physical damage. So our skill rotation for early game mob clear is going to be throwing Contagion down on some small weak enemy, like the smaller bramble apes in the Hunting Grounds, for example, or the dogs in Ogham Farmland. And then we're going to throw Flash Grenade into the mob to do chip damage and help that Contagion get all the way through. And then against bosses, we're going to be throwing big piles of Explosive Grenades and staggerring that with regular crossbow shots as well in order to deal with bosses in Act 1. I've shown an example of an Act 1 weapon. This is much better than what you actually need to kill late Act 1 bosses like the Executioner and Geonor, but just as an example, anything that has good damage prefixes, doesn't matter what they are, could be fire, lightning, cold, flat physical, increased physical damage, could have suffixes of projectile skills or attack speed. It doesn't really matter so long as we're making sure to upgrade our weapon as quickly as we are getting drops. The weapon bases that you're going to be looking for throughout Act 1 are the level 1 makeshift crossbow, and then transitioning as soon as you can to the level 4 tense and the level 10 sturdy. You're not going to invest any currency in these beyond a transmute and an augment. We're going to make sure to hold on to our regals for our Act 2 and eventually Act 3, 4, and early mapping weapons. But we want to make sure that we're not spending regals on these. Just anything that has a big chunky damage prefix is good enough. We'll find some things on floor. We can also shop at vendor in order to get a couple of options. You can really do this with even a very bad weapon. You don't need to worry about this. Grenades have incredible DPS. That will not be the problem that you are running into. One thing I want to point out about some gear priorities, though, is that if you happen to get items that have maximum life, that is going to be incredibly important for your early survivability. A lot of the slams that can happen later on in Act 1 against bosses like the Executioner or Geonor can do around 200 total physical damage, and starting out as a dexterity-based class, we aren't going to be that tanky. Getting up to something like 200, 250 max life before we fight the Executioner is going to be very, very important, and similarly, we're hoping for 250 or 300 max life against Geonor, which will help us not only to survive his big attacks, but to prevent getting frozen by increasing our ailment threshold. So max life is a big gear priority for us, regardless of the base type of the item. If we find a really good evasion or ES base, then we're happy to use that, provided that it gives us 20, 24, 29 max life like we can get in Act 1. Similarly, offensively, if you have the luxury of choice, on gloves and rings, you're going to be looking for things like 1 to 10 lightning damage. You prefer lightning to fire and fire to either cold or physical on your weapons, just because you want to be able to apply shock and get that nice damage multiplier. But anything that has a big damage number on it is good, and you have the luxury of grenades providing incredible bossing damage, so it doesn't matter too much exactly what element it is. This is totally SSF and League Start viable. I've done literally hundreds of runs on both Ranger and Mercenary with crossbows. You'll be fine. If you have the luxury of choice, prioritize lightning if you can. Similarly, if you happen to find items that have intelligence on them, on your helm or on a ring, for example, and you end up with an extra extra skill gem, you can upgrade your Contagion and dramatically improve the speed of your clear through those denser zones like Freythorn and Ogham Farmland. That's just an optional thing to do. You definitely don't need to hunt out items with intelligence on them, but just know that satisfying those higher level 2, level 3 skill gem priorities is going to be a big benefit to your progression time through Act 1. But we're not trying to invest heavily in Contagion. It's not something that we're looking for very dramatically. It's just something that can help us smooth out our Act 1, and then our build really comes online at the end of Act 1 when we get Gas Grenade. Gas Grenade provides big AoE gas clouds. There's a limit of 6 of them active at a time, which means if we cut multi-shot 1, we're now firing 3 gas grenades, and we have a limit of 6 active gas clouds, so we will want to do just 2 shots of gas grenade, 3, and then 6, and then fire our explosive grenades. It takes a little bit of practice to get used to exactly how you place these gas grenades. I'll give you a build showcase at the end of this so you can see some subtler nuances of how to get your grenades to go where you want them, but that provides enormous bossing damage. That said, it's perfectly fine to just go ahead and fight Geonor without a level 5 skill gem. If you run it through the manor and you get there at level 13 or even level 12, that's actually very manageable if you're a high skill player. You don't need gas grenade at all in order to kill Geonor. One thing that I do want to say is that you want to be pretty careful about where you stand in the Geonor fight. In particular, he likes to make long lunges, and that means he can walk off of the pile of your grenades. So staying a little bit closer to him and using those dodge rolls to make sure that you're not tanking his attacks, but that he is using melee things to stay in a shorter in a closer position to your grenade pile can be incredibly important. If you're curious for a showcase of exactly what that looks like, elsewhere on my YouTube channel, you can watch my speedrun PB, or an old speedrun PB from me, and you can see exactly how I bait out attack cycles from bosses to keep them standing on top of those grenades. Then I want to show you the Act 1 tree. Our Act 1 tree, we're just going to take a bunch of points in projectile damage, and we're just going to take the simple bonuses along the tree here, and then we're just going to take we're going to work our way down toward Primal Sundering. We actually don't want to take Primal Sundering. It's not a big priority for us. But along the way, you'll notice that in order to equip crossbows, if we don't end up with strength on gear, we will need to put an early point in strength here, and likely another point in strength here in order to get that level 4 and level 10 equip requirement. So it's very likely that you would put your level 2 point here, your level 3 point here, your level 4 point in strength, then continue to progress all the way down until you go strength. And I've shown int if you had the extra skill gem and wanted to cut contagion to a higher level, but otherwise you would be able to put these points into strength or dex in order to satisfy equipment requirements. One thing to note though is you do need to save up gold pretty aggressively toward the end of Act 1, because we're actually going to refund all 10 of these points and transition into a build that is friendlier to our Act 2 progression. And so I will show you the Act 2 tree now. And you'll notice we refunded all of these points here, and then we're going to work our way through these flask benefits and all the way over to heavy ammunition and careful aim. And that means that we will then be able to do big stun buildup and have higher projectile damage and work our way over to the mercenary portion of the tree where we can get grenade benefits. A couple of things I want to point out here. We take these projectile damage bonuses, and then we actually want to... Excuse me? All right, well, I'll cheat a little bit here, and I'll show you the next tree over here, and we can work on the rest of it in a second. So what you're going to do is you're going to work your way through Remorseless and eventually Ricochet all the way over down to make sure that you get to the Grenadier wheel as soon as possible in Act 2. You should be getting here around the time that you're in your late 20s, gearing up for that Jamunra fight for those late Act 2 bosses. And the reason that you want this so badly is because it allows you to get big amounts of grenade cooldown recovery rate. This is going to be incredibly important because against those late Act 2 bosses, when your damage starts to fall off, you're going to really want to be able to spam those grenades much more effectively, and that's going to be incredibly important to take these 3 points, as well as to get grenade skills have +1 cooldown use. And then you're going to double back and take the Overwhelm and Colossal Weapon nodes, along with all of these increased two-handed weapon damage points, and that will get you the amount of damage that you need to get through Act 3. Then you're going to be able to work your way down to the bottom of the tree and take all the way down to Repeating Explosives. Repeating Explosives is in essence a 15% more damage multiplier. Grenades have a 15% chance to activate a second time. It's statistical, it's stochastic, it's random, but in essence it's a 15% more damage multiplier, which is about as good as things can get in Path of Exile 2. Then as you're looking for a little bit more damage, if you really want more damage at that point in mid-Act 3, what you can do is you can go ahead and take Demolitionist early, but what I recommend instead is that at that point you are pretty likely to start struggling defensively around level 30, 35, 40, and so what I've written into the build planner is that you would take these stun threshold nodes, including especially steady footing, and then you would work your way through a little bit of increased armor, stun threshold, and flask benefits. I feel quite strongly that because you're already naturally pathing through combat alchemy as well as these life and mana recovery from flask nodes, that hard to kill is going to be incredibly valuable to you. You're not only getting on-tree benefits to the amount of recovery that you're getting from your flasks, but on-tree benefits to the rate of recovery from your flasks. Since we're expecting to be currency poor on day one of the league, no one's going to have a bunch of regals and exalts to trade us yet. The currency exchange will not be well populated if you're quick into the end game, and as a consequence, your defenses might be suffering because you have to allocate all of your regals and exalts to your weapon in a semi-SSF environment on league start. Using our flask as our primary defensive layer as we get through Act 3, 4, and the interludes is a strategy that I really strongly prefer and that I've been accustomed to using from many speedrun attempts when you expect to find deficient chest pieces and helms, and this will be incredibly important. So flask modifiers are our friends. If we find flasks that have big increases to the amount of recovery, that's phenomenal. We also would, as a secondary choice, prefer flasks that take instant recovery. Of course, the better our flask is, the more important, the easier it is for us to survive. So we really want to invest heavily in those flasks throughout Act 2, 3, and 4. I'll show you an example of an early Act 2 weapon that would be positively phenomenal to run into. This is the highest possible set of modifiers you can find on a level 16 weapon. This is the place, by the way, where we're going to invest all of our regals and exalts that we may have saved from all of Act 1 and early Act 2. 84% increased physical damage, 12 to 22 physical damage, and 2 levels of all projectile skills is more than enough to get all the way into mid-Act 3. Realistically, you're probably not going to run into the double fizz synergy, and more likely you're going to run into something like a big chunk of lightning damage. You can get up to about 3 to 40 lightning damage there, or a big chunk of fire damage, and those would be great as well. Anything that has a big damage number on it is great. Whatever you find off the ground or in the vendor that has at least one really good prefix is going to be incredibly valuable for you to craft on. We also want to save any runes that we get in Act 1 to make sure that we cut things with our alchemist's orbs and socket in storm runes to try and make sure that we get deterministic access to shock as a multiplier. We're going to be holding on to this weapon all the way from level 16 to 33, unless GGG decides to rebalance crossbows the way that they have with the other martial weapons bases in advance of 0.4. In any case, if you're struggling to find a good weapon, just know that you want to hold on to a lot of your crafting currency, those regals, exalts, runes, and artificer's orbs to make sure that you can craft a really high tier varnished crossbow at level 16. You're going to invest all of your quality, your whetstones, everything else that you can in order to get this through you, all the way from level 16 to level 33. Since we are, over the course of that time, tapering down the strength of our weapon compared to the difficulty of the content that we're facing, that's why there's such heavy early offensive investment in the tree that I've designed for you to play, where you're going to take heavy ammunition and careful aim, and then eventually all these grenade bonuses overwhelm colossal weapon, and then you're going to come down here and take even more offense. Then once we get to level 33 and our weapon has jumped back up again in quality, that's when we're going to be able to double back for a little bit more defense. So we're trying to use our tree to compensate for the excesses and deficiencies in weapon crafting that we expect to run into on league start. The second thing that I want to show you is an example of a really good level 33 bombard crossbow. This is unrealistically nice. This is the equivalent of a mirror tier bombard crossbow, but just to show you an example of what you could get in early to mid Act 3, you can see that we can get up to 109% IPD, 17 to 30 physical damage, 4 to 76 lightning damage, and 4 to level of all projectile skills. Again, that is dramatically stronger than what you actually need to kill Tavakai. Realistically, anything that has increased physical damage above about 70% or a big chunk of physical damage on the order of like 12 to 25, lightning damage above 60, fire damage above 30, anything like that is more than good enough, provided that you get at least 2 good prefix modifiers, by which I mean if you get top tier IPD and top tier lightning, that's more than good enough. If you get top tier fire and top tier cold, that's good enough. You only need 2 points. I've shown you one that has 4. Then the other thing that I want to point out is as we transition into the mid game, at level 31, we're going to get access to Oil Grenade. Oil Grenade is incredibly important for us, not only because it applies elemental exposure, which allows us to kill fire-resistant bosses like Zikawatl, Warden of the Soul Core, or Ketzuli, High Priest of the Sun in Act 3, but also because it allows us to auto-ignite enemies, and that means that we can then spam our gas grenades throughout Act 3. This is incredibly important because Explosive Grenade has a long cooldown and a long detonation timer, so against a lot of those hyper-mobile Act 3 and 4 bosses, like Viper, like Ketzuli, like the Prisoner, they're like the Mermaid, for example. There are a lot of these bosses that like to move around. Keeping them ignited by throwing out an oil grenade, doing some fire damage with an initial explosive grenade, then allows us to stack up gas grenades, which then pop and get consumed by that ignite very, very quickly, and that makes boss fights a lot easier in Act 3 and 4. Again, you're welcome to scrub through my speedrun explained video if you want to see some demonstration of exactly what that looks like in practice. But just so you know, oil grenade is incredibly important. Additionally, we're going to get access to higher tier supports. I've shown an example here of Flash Grenade being supported by Stun 2. More realistically, you're going to have Stun 1, which is a tier 2 support, and then you're going to get your first Lesser Jeweler's Orbs and allow these to be cut into concentrated area, so that way you have upgrades there. The other thing that I want to point out is that we've upgraded from Multi-Shot 1 and Elemental Armament 1 to higher tier variants of both. These are very low priority upgrades for us, but also Oil Grenade can have something like Potent Exposure, which can give us a damage multiplier against enemies. Our damage cycle against just enemies as we're running through maps is to throw out an explosive grenade. It has a 4-second detonation timer, and while it's counting down, we throw out gas grenades on top of it, which spread poison, and then those poison clouds are consumed when the explosive grenade pops. I'll show you an example of this at the end of that video so you can get a sense of what the skill cycling feels like. And then after we have all of that, we want to continue to progress through the game. And then we reach the final point that I want to make about our mid-game progression, which is that in order to get deeper into the tree more quickly, our first 2 Ascendancy points, either from Trial of Sekhama's in Act 2 or from Trial of Chaos in Act 3, are actually going to be spent on Traveler's Wisdom. We plan to take other bonuses when we're mapping. We'll be respecking out of this, but those 6 passive points get us deeper into the tree really, really early and give us a big power spike. So if you're struggling against Jamunra, you can always go back and ascend, and that will give you a few extra points to spend there to get you to those stronger offensive bonuses. Then, as we transition into the real late game, I want to explain just a little bit of what the vision is here. And so I'm going to look away from the build planner for a moment and show you an example of what the game really looks like as we play it. So what we're looking for at level 52 is this skill gem right here, Cluster Grenades. And what Cluster Grenades does for us is it throws a bouncing grenade that explodes, throwing mini grenades inside of it. And so our goal here is that we want to be able to run and gun by dealing with cluster grenades. And so our goal is that we're going to be running, and then we get multiple cluster grenades thrown out, and each one throws out 18 sub grenades here. There have been changes to the Nova Projectile support gem that make this a really powerful mapping tool where we get a very, very high number of sub projectiles, and if we stack up area damage and we can deal with the long cooldown and long detonation timer using on-tree benefits as well as support gems, we can then get huge single button massive screen clearing benefits. Of course, this is a clunkier skill to use, so we're going to be investing in a lot of quality of life for it, and then trying to invest a lot of our early mapping currency, our first few exalts, our first divine, in making sure that we can jump up weapon tiers very, very aggressively early on. And that way we can get a cannonade crossbow like this that has a big chunk of fire damage, or in my case, increased elemental damage with attacks and projectile skills. This is more than good enough for me to clear tier 5, tier 8 maps with. And so our playstyle will be to run and gun, and run and gun, and try and kite enemies into these big AoE screen clears. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Now, what I want to point out is that as we do this, we want to make sure that we are binding that we're continuing to have a single target damage solution. Cluster grenades is incredibly useful for a single press to be able to run through the map and get all the way out to those stronger map bosses. But then once we get there, cluster grenades is very, very effective because it spreads its damage over such a large area. So what we're going to do is on weapon set 2, we're going to invest heavily in attack area damage. using nodes like this to increase our area of effect. And then also we want to deal with the very, very long cooldown by putting a bunch of our weapons at 2 points into cooldown recovery rate for our cluster grenades. So that way we can continue to do this. We are of course going to be able to use a second cooldown use. Like you saw there, I have 2 uses available, and that's going to be a big deal. And then in order to make sure that our skill is able to cover these large areas, our first greater jeweler's orb is actually going to be cut onto cluster grenades. We're going to slot in Nova projectiles and eventually Nova projectiles 2, and then eventually cooldown recovery, short fuse to make sure that those enemies don't run off of that large cluster grenades before they can detonate, and then fire attunement. Now, if you end up with a weapon that has an element on it other than fire, we want to make sure that we do this. However, cluster grenades has a very low amount of conversion to fire damage, both for the primary grenade and the secondary grenade. And so as a consequence, the downside of fire attunement here is much, much smaller for cluster grenades than it is for explosive grenades. So it's actually perfectly fine to use fire attunement, even if your endgame weapon had some very important, huge amount of lightning damage, like I've shown here, for example, with, again, an unrealistically nice early mapping weapon. We're going to continue using explosive grenade and gas grenade as our tools to deal with bosses. And so we want to use bossing specific nodes in order to do that. So on weapon set 1, we're going to bind the same weapon, but different skills. And so we're going to be using explosive grenade and gas grenade on weapon set 1 with important notables like cluster bombs that allow us to fire an additional projectile, but give us a rather clunky increase to our grenade detonation time. Or similarly, we're going to take specialized bonuses like Giant Slayer, where we get increased damage with hits against rare and unique enemies and higher chance to inflict ailments. Similarly, we get very powerful 16% damage nodes here as well. And along the bottom of our tree here, you can see that Demolitionist rewards us for playing a more multifaceted, higher diversity of skill usage build. Demolitionist on cluster bombs would do very little for us, because as we're running through the map, we're going to get very, very little multi-skill damage off, just single pressing cluster grenades and using our explosive and gas only for rare and magic packs. And then when we get to the bosses, then we're going to be whipping out our full oil, gas, explosive, and flash cycle, where we then get 16% gain as fire damage from Demolitionist. So that is the basic idea of the tree. If you have any particular questions, you're more than welcome to join me on Twitch or ask them in the YouTube comments down below. Then I want to point out what we are going to be doing as we get later on into maps and we have more points to expend. I've shown the tree in the build planner will have higher early investment in armor in particular. And we're going to be using armor applies to elemental damage as well as just higher amount of armor in general. And so we want to continue to invest in that. However, the ultimate goal of the build is going to actually be that we do enough offense that we don't need much defense. And so once we have a very strong weapon and we're a little bit higher in our offensive investment on tree, we're going to unspec some of these points and come over to this wheel. This is my favorite wheel on the tree, together with Pathfinder's upgrades to being unable to be stunned while sprinting, as well as reduced skill penalty for movement. You're going to invest heavily over here in the namesake wheel of the whole build, which is run and gun and spray and pray. We get 50% increased attack damage while moving, as well as reduced movement speed penalty from skills, as well as projectile attacks have a 12% chance to fire additional projectiles while moving. And leading up to these, we get more attack damage and reduced movement speed penalty, allowing us to really accelerate the build to be much more fluid in its movement throughout. Now that I haven't put that on the tree in the planner, because I expect you to make a judgment call about when your amount of defense and offense feel balanced and when you can respec toward those quality of life nodes like run and gun and spray and play that allow you to move into that portion of the tree and endgame where you're then running and gunning and spraying and praying. Now, I'm going to trust you that you know what it feels like for you when the build is good enough. If you're uncomfortable dying in maps and you want more defensive investment, you can do a whole lot of that. So that's the weapon swap explained, as well as some investment in offense and quality of life that you can make. It's to your taste how you spend the remaining of these points. I will eventually be publishing a Path of Building or a Pee-wee Ninja for what my actual personal character is, but up to around level 70, this is pretty much my plan for day one of Path of Exile 2's Fate of the Vol League. Couple of problems that you'll expect to run into early on in the league. Like I said, you'll expect that starting as a dexterity character, you have lower max life and you may be getting light stunned and action interrupted a bit more than you're used to, which is why I think that these early stun threshold nodes like Steady Footing and Feel No Pain are so important. Other defensive problems that you may run into is if you don't have the ability to spec into more life on tree, or if you find a dearth of gear that has resistances, things can really struggle. In my particular playthrough, I ran into those resistance problems quite a lot, despite investing heavily in gambling for rings or in hunting down items that would give me additional resistances, which is why we're going to invest in tempered defenses, as well as pretty aggressively pursue armor applies to elemental damage as an early mapping solution. When we get later into maps, say tier 8, tier 10 plus, we'll want to be transitioning out of this as we accumulate currency to be able to trade for other items. And I will be publishing a update to this guide around a week into the league when you can expect to transition off of armor and elemental armor in order to find higher defensive efficacy. So just know that you expect to find that as a problem, and you really want to aggressively pursue resistances and max life over armor, because you're going to struggle a lot with early ailment and stun threshold, and just stacking max life and resistances is going to be important. The other thing that I want to note is that, again, we expect our early mapping and our late campaign and interludes to be dominated by the defensive effect of our flask. And so we want to make sure, if we can, that we're prioritizing using a rawhide belt, because the more we double down into that flask synergy, where we get the on-tree benefits to amount and rate of recovery, the more that will synergize with our rawhide belt providing increased life recovery from flasks, and therefore we're going to continue to be able to sort of cover up some of our itemization deficiencies early on in the league with strong flask bonuses, which we can spec out of once we get stronger tier bases around the time that we reach level 70 to 80, maybe 85. We really want to be transitioning away from this solution, but in my limited playtesting, because I've been sick over the last 2 days, I haven't had quite time to publish an authoritative guide on what I'm going to be doing late in mapping, because I wanted to get this out to you guys who are looking for a day 1 and day 2 league start plan, and I'll be publishing more updates to this Maxroll planner over the course of the day. Then I want to show you a couple of quick gameplay tips here. So I'm just going to hop back into this boss arena on my actual character, just so I can show you a couple of tips about grenade placement. One thing I want to point out is with cluster grenade, and in fact with all grenades, if I put my cursor closer to my character, my grenades stay closer together. So if a boss were spawning, I would want to do that. But you can see that if I change my cursor placement from, say, here to here, I can place my grenades not only farther away, but further apart. As I'm cluster grenading my way through the map, I might be running, and I want to keep my cursor closer and farther away to determine just how much area coverage I get out of those cluster grenades. And getting a feel for this can be incredibly important. Against bosses like Gianor and Jamanra, early on in the campaign, you'll want to be especially mindful of how exactly you place your cursor and how that affects where the grenades go. You can see that you can place them at different distances to get different gas cloud coverage or different stun coverage as well from all of your different grenades. And so that'll be incredibly important. I've also decided to put Nova projectiles into oil grenade in my personal build, and that's because I want cluster grenade to be able to ignite larger amounts of area, so that way if there's a rare that moves around a lot in the middle of a map, I can then use my other skills on top of it with that big AoE ignited oil grenades there. So that's the first thing. I want you to be very aware of your cursor placement on console. I unfortunately don't play console, and I don't know how to deal with it, but on desktop, on mouse and keyboard, you want to be especially mindful of your cursor placement and how it affects where your skills end up located. You can see that standing in the same position and aiming in the same direction, my projectiles spread out a lot more, and that can really affect how your area coverage feels. The second thing is that a lot of people may not be used to this particular setup where you bind one weapon to both skill slots. And so I just wanted to show you that if you mouse over the top of your inventory here, where you see your weapon set, you can then go ahead and right click to lock to all weapon sets. And now both of my weapon sets are occupied by the same item. And if I open my skill panel, I can now show you what it looks like. For example, if I wanted to assign gas grenade here to a different weapon set, right now all my weapon set bonuses for weapon set 1 are my bossing bonuses used against rares and magic packs during the clearing of the map and against the boss at the end of the map. That's going to be assigned to weapon set 1, whereas cluster grenade here is on weapon set 2, and these will use the same weapon for both. So I just wanted to show you guys how to do that. That said, this is the build guide. There will be a link to the Maxroll planner as well as to my Twitch below this video. I hope that you guys enjoy your start of 0.4. This is just one idea tuned to my particular playstyle preferences, but it should give you a way to get through campaign as well as early maps before you either continue on with the idea or transition on else to something else that you enjoy. If you have any questions about this, go ahead and let me know in the comments down below. And I'll see you guys around at the start of Fate of the Vault. Bye now.